Well, if we're good, I'm just going to wrap this up here. Let's talk a little bit about the timeline. Now, this is a modified version of the simple timeline I gave you a couple weeks ago. I went ahead and added a couple of things that I want to point out to you. But before I add the modifications, let me just say there are three basic things to keep in mind time-wise when you're talking about the Old Testament. There are three basic time periods. You've got before the exile, and after the exile. The exile I'm referring to, I'll explain in a minute, but for the moment, just be aware that Babylon invaded, took pretty much all that was left of Israel to Babylon. This is the stories Daniel in the lion's den. This is the story of Esther. These are stories like Nehemiah, when rebuilding the wall. Ezra, they eventually did come back. So before the exile, during the exile, after the exile. The second thing, before the exile is broken down into three pieces. You had the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You had the Exodus and the Judges. Okay, that's when they left Egypt, when they took the promised land and they lived in it up to before they had a king. So the patriarchs, Exodus and Judges, and then the time of kings. So three categories, and the first one breaks down into three. And then we've gone over a little bit of this, but around 2000 BC, and the reason I'm starting with Abraham is because dates for things like the flood and the Tower of Babel and creation are a little less clear. Whereas we do have a bit more we can use when it comes to, say, starting with Abraham, who technically was in the late Bronze Age, but you don't have to remember that. So around 2000 BC, you have Abraham called out by God. He's the seed money, begins the going concern with his own family. 1400, Moses and the Exodus. 1350, Joshua and taking the promised land. 1000, you've got King David and a united kingdom. North Israel and Judah joined as a kingdom. And that works all the way through the end of his son Solomon's reign. But then after that, Solomon's son messes things up, and the kingdom splits into 10 northern tribes and 10 southern tribes, and the two southern tribes, Judah and Levi. So in 722, you've got Assyria completely wiping out North Israel. The huge, I'd say maybe 80+% of Israel just ceased to exist. This Assyrian king showed up, killed almost everyone, took the rest of the people captive, and then took in a bunch of indigenous people from other cultures and put them in their place. When these different groups mixed with the Assyrian invaders and what was left of the Israelites up there, you end up with what are known as Samaritans. This changes our understanding just a little bit of, say, the Good Samaritan or the woman at the well, when we understand why, quote, Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. This had to do with the fact that essentially Samaritans gave in. They capitulated. They gave up their culture, their religion, and their faith to these surrounding tribes, and they lost their cultural identity. Then in 586, this is when Babylon surrounds and destroys Jerusalem, takes them captive for 70 years, and then in 517, Ezra and Nehemiah help rebuild the wall. That's the summary, but I want to point out two things. One, as I've told you guys before, not everybody who reads the Bible understands that there's huge gaps of time where it isn't like you're walking into poisonous snakes and earthquakes and miracles and famines and droughts every day. If you were to put a circle between right before 1400 BC and a circle after 517, those are two periods where there are 400 years of silence. There are 400 years of silence between Joseph bringing his brothers to Egypt for them to stay in the land of Goshen and the time of Moses. And then at the end, Nehemiah and rebuilding the wall, there are 400 years between the book of Malachi, which we'll get into in a moment, and the first gospel. So there's two times where there's just no word. Silence. Amos 8:11 says, there will come a time where there is a drought of the word of the Lord. In Amos 6:10, you've got someone saying, hey, don't even say the Lord's name. He's not happy with us right now. So that's the first thing I would point out on this timeline, and I didn't include it because I didn't want to make it too complicated. The second thing I would say is if three things is too much to keep track of, here's just two things. When they were called out of Egypt as a people, and when they were called out of Babylon as a people, in both cases, they would have become extinct if God had not acted to call them out back to their land where they could become a distinct people serving the Lord. Almost all of the Old Testament is wrapped up in these two ideas. You could even think of them as a first Exodus and a second Exodus. And that kind of sums up the timeline. We have a few minutes before I go into the book, so I wanted to see if this raised any questions or anything you guys wanted to know more about.
When were they called out of Babylon?
It's going to be around 517 BC, right at the end of the timeline.
Okay.
Yeah, when Ezra and Nehemiah helped rebuild the wall, they brought an exodus of people out of Babylon. By then it had become the Persian Empire, and I believe it was under King Xerxes, and then later Cyrus. You'll see references to this in Ezra and Nehemiah, edicts where the kings say that the people can go back to their land and rebuild their temple, with governmental sanction. Does that help? Okay.
I got a question.
Yeah, please.
So on the handout here, we've got the 3 different times: the patriarchs, the Exodus, and the Judges, and the Kings.
Mm-hmm.
On the other page, where you go over kind of what you would likely not find, what you would likely find, are there any variations in kind of the scene throughout those different periods?
Here's kind of everything changed. There was a big cultural change in archaeological terms between, say, the time of Abraham and the time of Kings. Because the time of Abraham was known as the Late Bronze Age. The technology they used for farming was different. It was harder to produce food, so there was less trade. When they settled into the land, since they failed to wipe out the other cultures properly, and there wasn't good literature, there wasn't good roads, people fell into what's known as apostasy very quickly. They went to imitate what the other cultures were doing. What happened is other cultures back then very much had this idea that if you don't have good irrigation, whether it rains or not is life and death. And so, how if you go to Las Vegas and you deal with people who are gambling compulsively, they are often very superstitious. They'll have their lucky charms or their lucky, slot machine or their lucky shirt they wear when they play blackjack or whatever. This comes out of the fact that when you feel helpless or vulnerable and it's life or death, you will grab onto anything that might possibly give you an edge. And so, particularly during the time of Judges, when everyone did right did what they thought was best, which is really anything goes, and there was no king in Israel, that was the end of the Bronze Age, before the beginning of the Iron Age. And what happens is you had major upheavals. You had entire cultures just being destroyed because of changes in technology, because of natural disasters, because of cultural movements. And so the time of the Judges is really dark. And when you establish a kingship under Saul and then David, things did look a little better for them. And then you had the height. One thing I had meant to mention, if you look on the page at the bottom at 930 BC, King Solomon and Kingdom Divided, if you want to write this in the margin, it is the high point of their culture in physical terms. There was so much wealth, and there was so much power, and so many resources pouring into Israel that it says that silver, nobody even bothered collecting. You couldn't weigh the amount of gold people had. And silver was so common, it was like stones. People didn't bother to pick it up. So there was a time, in completely natural terms, as the world measures things, that Israel had an absolute high point. And then, if you look at 722, you can write this in the margins, low point. 80% of your nation has been destroyed and is never coming back. 10 of the 12 tribes that descend from Abraham are gone. And then, by 586 BC, at the bottom of the page, Jerusalem destroyed, you can write lowest point. This, in every sense, left a permanent mark on all of Israel as a culture in perpetuity. This is why the book of Esther is so concerned with extinction, with Haman wanting to wipe out the Jews. They were already in a foreign country. If the foreign powers had turned on them, they didn't have walls, they didn't have military, they didn't have government. It was the absolute lowest possible point of helplessness. And it affected their culture and everything that was written after that. So high point, low point, and lowest point. So yeah, the time of the Judges was really harsh. It was very chaotic, very dog-eat-dog. Then the kings started out well with Solomon. And then slowly got worse. The kingdom split after Solomon, the 10 northern tribes got wiped out, and then Judah started behaving even more badly than North Israel did before they got wiped out. Does that help?
Yeah.
As far as time goes, we're down to 9 minutes, so